The emperor's bare feet slapped against cold stone as he stumbled through the underground passage, his purple toga catching on rough walls. 30 men waited in the shadows of the cryptoporticus, their breath forming small clouds in the January chill. They weren't there to protect him. In their minds echoed the screams of daughters, wives and sisters who'd been summoned to the palace and returned broken, if they returned at all. The man who called himself a living god was about to discover that even gods could bleed. "Your divinity," Cassius Chaerea's voice dripped with mockery as he stepped from the darkness. The Praetorian tribune's hand already gripped his gladius beneath his cloak. Behind Caligula, more figures emerged, blocking any escape. The emperor's eyes darted between them, searching for the loyalty that gold and fear had always purchased. But this wasn't about money or power anymore. This was about the things that couldn't be undone. You probably know Caligula as the mad emperor who made his horse a consul. But how does a child beloved by Roman legions transform into someone who would turn the imperial palace into a brothel, forcing senators' wives to serve as strangers while their husbands watched? To understand how systematic sexual terror became state policy, we need to go back 28 years to a military camp on the Rhine, where a 2-year-old boy in miniature soldier's boots was about to learn that in Rome, power meant never having to say no to your darkest impulses. How does a child who once charmed battle-hardened soldiers with his tiny military boots become the architect of an empire-wide system of sexual humiliation so grotesque that even Rome's most depraved citizens recoiled in horror? To understand why 30 men decided that divine blood needed to spill in that underground passage, we have to witness the birth of little Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in a rain-soaked military tent, where his first breath would set in motion the most catastrophic collision of absolute power and human cruelty the ancient world had ever seen. The Rhine frontier in 14 AD wasn't a place for children, unless you count the Germanic ones being sold as slaves after their fathers died fighting Rome's endless expansion. But there was one Roman child who called this frozen hellscape home. Little Gaius Caesar, barely 3 years old, toddled between the tents in his miniature military uniform. The soldiers had crafted him tiny boots, exact replicas of their own Caligula. They loved their general's son. They called him their little soldier, their Caligula. The morning executions had become his favorite entertainment. While other children his age played with wooden toys, Caligula sat on his father Germanicus's knee, watching deserters being flogged until their backs looked like raw meat. The child's laughter rang out each time the whip cracked. The soldiers thought it was adorable, their little mascot, cheering as men screamed. Nobody thought to question why a toddler found such joy in human suffering. After all, this was how Rome maintained discipline. But the real education came during the victory celebrations. Germanic prisoners, men who'd defended their villages against Roman steel, were brought out for sport. The legionaries had creative ways of making examples. Crucifixion was standard, but they'd learned that variety kept the troops entertained. Sometimes they'd force captured warriors to fight each other with broken weapons. Sometimes they'd see how long a man could survive with his intestines wrapped around a post. And through it all, little Caligula watched from his special seat, his tiny boots swinging as he clapped at each new horror. His mother Agrippina tried to shield him at first, but after 3 years on the frontier, even she had grown numb to the violence. She had bigger worries. Letters from Rome spoke of jealousy in Tiberius's court, of whispers that her husband Germanicus was too popular, too successful. She taught her son to trust no one, to see enemies in every shadow. At night, while the camp slept, she'd hold him close and whisper about their divine blood, about his destiny to rule. The child absorbed these lessons between the daytime lessons in cruelty. The soldiers didn't just teach him about violence, they taught him about power. When supplies ran low and the men grew restless, they'd raid local villages for women. Caligula learned early that conquest meant taking whatever you wanted. He watched officers drag screaming girls into their tents. He heard the sounds that followed. When he asked his father what was happening, Germanicus just ruffled his hair and said he'd understand when he was older. The other officers laughed. Their little boot would grow up to be a proper Roman man. Then came the night that changed everything. A Germanic priestess, captured during a temple raid, was brought before Germanicus. She was young, maybe 15. with the kind of beauty that made soldiers forget discipline. The general decided to make her a gift to his officers. One by one, in the command tent, with little Caligula watching from behind a partition, the child didn't understand what he was seeing, but he understood the power dynamic. The strong taking from the weak, the conquered serving the conqueror, the priestess's screams mixing with the men's laughter. What happened next would haunt even the hardened legionaries. The girl broke free, grabbed a dagger from the nearest officer's belt, but instead of attacking her tormentors, she turned the blade on herself. Blood sprayed across the tent walls, across the officers' faces, across the gap where a 3-year-old boy watched with eyes that had already seen too much. As she died, she spoke a curse in her native tongue. The translator later said she'd promised that Rome's cruelty would birth a monster that would devour the empire from within. Germanicus died 2 years later in Syria. Poison, Agrippina insisted. Murder by jealous rivals. As they prepared his body for the funeral pyre, 5-year-old Caligula stood in his little boots, watching the flames consume his father. His mother gripped his shoulders, her nails digging in as she whispered about vengeance, about their divine right to rule, about the enemies who surrounded them. The seeds planted in blood on the Rhine frontier were starting to sprout. The funeral games for Germanicus featured gladiator fights and beast hunts, but young Caligula found them boring compared to what he'd witnessed in the camps. These were performances, choreographed violence for public consumption. He missed the genuine terror in the prisoners' eyes, the way men begged in languages he didn't understand, the creative ways the soldiers invented to break human bodies. Rome's civilian entertainments seemed sanitized by comparison. If the Rhine camps were his elementary school in cruelty, then Emperor Tiberius's island of Capri would become his university. And the curriculum was about to get infinitely darker. The splash wasn't from the Mediterranean waves. It was the sound of another broken body hitting the rocks below Tiberius's cliff. The emperor stood at the edge of his villa's terrace, adjusting his silk robe, while slaves rushed to retrieve what remained of the kitchen boy who'd spilled wine at dinner. 17-year-old Caligula watched from the shadows, counting. That made 3 this week. The old man was getting predictable in his cruelties. The island of Capri had become Tiberius's private kingdom of perversion, a place where the 72-year-old emperor could indulge appetites that would have caused riots in Rome, where screams echoed off marble walls and disappeared into the sea wind, where a teenage boy with divine blood learned that power meant the ability to transform human beings into objects for amusement. Caligula had arrived here 6 years ago, the sole surviving male of his family, walking into a nightmare dressed as paradise. The dinner parties were the worst, not because of what happened. He'd grown numb to that, but because of the performance required. Smile at the right moments. Laugh at Tiberius's jokes while boys younger than him served wine with shaking hands. Pretend not to notice when one disappeared into the emperor's private chambers. Maintain the mask of the grateful grandnephew while memorizing every detail, every technique, every method of breaking a human spirit. But Tiberius had special plans for his successor that went beyond mere observation. The emperor called them his little fishes, children trained from infancy to swim between his legs in the villa's pools, their small mouths taught to perform acts that even Rome's most jaded prostitutes found repulsive. Caligula's first encounter with them came on a sweltering afternoon when Tiberius invited him for a swim. The pool's blue water hid horrors that made the Rhine executions look merciful. Children who'd been stolen from their families, reshaped into living toys through years of conditioning. Some, no older than 5, moving through the water with dead eyes and practiced movements. "You seem disturbed, nephew," Tiberius observed from his floating couch, his ancient body pale as a corpse in the sunlight. "Does the sight of pleasure upset you?" Caligula forced his face into an expression of curiosity rather than revulsion. He'd learned this game years ago. Show weakness, and you became the next toy. Show too much enthusiasm, and Tiberius grew suspicious. The key was to appear educable, eager to learn from the master. So he watched. He studied. He filed away every detail of how the emperor had created this system, how he maintained it, how he'd turned human children into aquatic performers of depravity. The lessons expanded beyond the pools. Tiberius had constructed entire rooms designed for specific tortures, each one a theatre for a different variety of suffering. The mirror chamber, where victims were forced to watch their own degradation from every angle. The silk room, where noble women learned their bloodlines meant nothing when faced with imperial desire. The lower chambers, where those who disappointed the emperor discovered how creative his Persian torturers could be with human anatomy. What Caligula witnessed next would become his blueprint for transforming Rome itself. A delegation from the Senate had arrived to discuss tax reforms. Respectable men in their 50s and 60s, expecting a formal meeting. Instead, Tiberius received them in his pleasure gardens, surrounded by naked children chained to posts like decorative statues. The senators tried to maintain dignity, discussing fiscal policy while trying not to see the horrors in their peripheral vision. But Tiberius wanted them to see, wanted them to understand that their laws, their traditions, their precious republic meant nothing before his will. Senator Marcellus, the emperor interrupted the tax discussion. I heard your daughter recently came of age. 15, isn't she? Such a delightful age. The threat hung unspoken but clear. Marcellus went pale, stammering agreement to whatever tax increase Tiberius wanted. The other senators quickly followed suit. They'd learned the price of defiance on this island of nightmares. After they left, Tiberius turned to his grandnephew with a teacher's smile. You see how easy they are to control? Find what they love, threaten to defile it, and they'll hand you their own swords to fall upon. Fear is temporary, but shame burrows into the soul like a parasite. Make a man complicit in his own degradation, and you own him forever. The most terrifying part wasn't what Caligula endured. It was what he was learning to enjoy. The transformation happened gradually. The first time Tiberius invited him to participate rather than simply observe, Caligula felt his mother's ghost screaming warnings. But he remembered her other lessons too. Survive, endure, wait for your moment. So he played the eager student, allowing Tiberius to guide his hands, to teach him the artistry of psychological destruction. How to read the exact moment when resistance broke, how to push just far enough to shatter a mind without destroying the body's usefulness. By his 19th birthday, Caligula had become Tiberius's star pupil. He'd learned to find genuine pleasure in others' suffering, to see human beings as canvases for creative cruelty. The boy who'd once laughed at executions had evolved into something far more dangerous, an artist of agony with the patience to wait for power and grand ambitions for when it arrived. The old emperor grew increasingly paranoid in his final years, seeing assassination plots in every shadow. He trusted no one except his twisted protégé, who'd proven his loyalty through shared depravity. Caligula played the part perfectly, the devoted grandnephew who'd absorbed all the right lessons. Inside, he was making plans that would make Tiberius's private island seem like a children's garden party. On March 16th of the year 37, Tiberius collapsed during another poolside orgy. The little fishes scattered as the emperor gasped for breath, his ancient heart finally giving out. Or perhaps it had help. Macro, the Praetorian prefect, stood very close to the imperial bed. So did Caligula. The historical record remains unclear about whether a pillow assisted the emperor's transition to the afterlife. What happened in those final moments mattered less than what came next. As Tiberius took his last rattling breath, possibly muffled by Egyptian cotton, Caligula stood beside the deathbed with an expression of perfect grief. Inside, his mind was already working, calculating how to transform Tiberius's private laboratory of horror into an empire-spanning industry. The old man had thought small, limiting his games to one island. But why constrain such artistry to Capri when all of Rome could become a stage? The Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor before Tiberius's body had even cooled. The Senate, those same men who'd cowered in the pleasure gardens, rushed to confirm the appointment. They thought they were getting a young, malleable ruler they could control. Someone who'd survived Tiberius must surely want to return to normalcy, to dignity, to the traditional Roman values the old emperor had so grotesquely violated. On March 16, 37 AD, Tiberius took his last breath, possibly helped along by Caligula's pillow, and Rome's new emperor had a fully formed vision of how to transform an empire into his personal torture chamber. The construction crews arrived at dawn, their tools clanking against marble as they assembled in the palace courtyard. They thought they were there for routine renovations, maybe adding a new bath suite or expanding the throne room. The foreman unrolled the architectural plans, and his face went white. Remove every interior door. Connect all bedrooms through new passages. Install hidden viewing panels in the walls. These weren't renovations. They were building something else entirely. Caligula supervised the work personally, his purple-trimmed toga swishing as he moved from room to room, marking walls for demolition with his own hand. The hammers began their rhythm, punctuated by the crash of falling plaster. With each barrier that fell, servants exchanged terrified glances. They understood what disappeared boundaries meant in a palace, where the emperor's appetites knew no limits. The sound of splintering wood echoed through corridors that would soon carry very different sounds. The first phase focused on the imperial family quarters. His three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, watched from their doorways as workers removed their locks, their privacy, their last illusion of safety. Drusilla tried to protest, but Caligula silenced her with a look that promised consequences for defiance. The workers pretended not to notice her tears as they chiseled away the bronze fittings that had protected her since childhood. By sunset, every private space had become public property, but the bedroom modifications were just the beginning of his architectural vision for systematic violation. The second phase introduced elements no Roman palace had ever contained. Observation chambers built into false walls, where selected witnesses could be forced to watch without being seen. Acoustic panels designed to amplify sounds of distress throughout entire wings. Restraint points disguised as decorative elements in every room. The craftsmen installed these horrors with shaking hands, understanding too late what they were creating. One carpenter was later found dead in his workshop, his own tools turned against him rather than complete his assigned chamber. Drusilla's room received special attention. Caligula ordered a connecting passage built directly to his own chambers, wide enough for immediate access, but narrow enough to prevent escape. He tested the route himself that first night, measuring how many steps it took, how many seconds. The slaves cleaning the corridor the next morning found nail marks in the wooden frame where someone had tried to claw their way out. They scrubbed the blood away in silence, already learning the first rule of the new palace: see nothing, hear nothing, survive another day. The dining halls underwent their own transformation. Traditional couches were replaced with specially designed furniture that could convert from banquet seating to restraint apparatus with a simple mechanism. Hidden compartments beneath the floors contained tools whose purposes the workers tried not to imagine. The kitchens gained direct access to private chambers, creating routes for bringing victims in and broken bodies out without passing through public areas. Every detail reflected a mind that had spent years planning this maze of horror. Word spread quickly among Rome's elite about the palace renovations. Senators' wives developed sudden illnesses when dinner invitations arrived. Young daughters were hastily sent to country estates for their health, but Caligula had anticipated this. He stationed Praetorian guards at every major house, taking careful note of which families attempted to flee the city. Those who ran would be the first to receive special invitations once the palace modifications were complete. The emperor had learned from Tiberius that fear worked best when combined with inescapable proximity. The observation chambers served a specific psychological purpose that even Tiberius hadn't fully grasped. Making husbands watch their wives' degradation wasn't just about the immediate trauma. It created a web of complicity, shame, and silence that would bind Rome's most powerful families to the emperor's will. The senator who'd witnessed his daughter's violation could never speak against Caligula without revealing his own presence in that chamber, his own failure to die defending her honor. The general, who'd been forced to observe his sister's torment, carried that knowledge like a disease, infecting every subsequent interaction with the imperial court. The servants who survived those early months developed symptoms that palace physicians couldn't explain: sudden trembling at the sound of footsteps, inability to sleep despite exhaustion. Some went mute entirely, their voices stolen by the things they'd witnessed. Others began harming themselves, small cuts and burns as if trying to create pain they could control. One chambermaid was found scratching the same word over and over into her arm. Clementia, mercy. The palace had become a factory for manufacturing broken souls. Caligula's three sisters existed in a special category of horror. Unlike other victims who might hope for eventual release or death, they lived as perpetual prisoners in plain sight, required to attend state dinners, to smile at foreign ambassadors, to maintain the facade of imperial dignity while bearing marks hidden beneath their silk stolas. Agrippina tried to maintain defiance, but even her iron will began to crack. Julia Livilla retreated into silence. And Drusilla, what happened to Drusilla would become the template for horrors that would soon spread beyond the palace walls. The emperor developed a routine: morning inspections of his human collection, afternoon demonstrations for specially selected audiences, evening celebrations where the boundaries between banquet and brutality dissolved entirely. The new architecture facilitated an industrialized system of suffering that operated with the efficiency of a military campaign. Victims moved through the modified passages like goods through a market, processed and discarded according to the emperor's shifting interests. Yet, even as screams echoed through the palace's new corridors, Caligula was already planning something far worse, turning Rome's most sacred public spaces into showcases for sexual horror. The crowd's cheers for blood suddenly choked into horrified silence as naked women were dragged onto the arena sand. These weren't criminals or slaves prepared for execution. The gold rings on their fingers caught the afternoon sun, marking them as wives of senators, daughters of generals, sisters of magistrates. Sand stuck to their bare skin as Praetorian guards forced them to their knees in the center of the amphitheater where gladiators usually died. 50,000 Romans sat frozen in the stone seats, their anticipation for the scheduled beast hunt curdling into something else entirely. Veterans who'd seen Germanic tribes skinned alive found themselves looking away. Mothers covered their children's eyes. The usual vendors hawking wine and figs fell silent, their cries dying in throats suddenly too dry to speak. Even the professional gamblers stopped taking bets, understanding instinctively that this wasn't entertainment anymore. Caligula rose from his imperial box, his white toga gleaming against purple cushions. His voice carried across the arena, through sheer force of expectation. Every Roman knew that voice now, had learned to fear its particular tone of theatrical excitement. He gestured toward the kneeling women, like an artist revealing his masterpiece. These ladies had forgotten their place, he announced. They'd whispered criticisms of imperial policy at private dinners. Their husbands had voted incorrectly in the Senate. Such disloyalty required public correction. The guards brought out the gladiators next, not the trained professionals who fought with honor and skill, but condemned criminals pulled from death row, men with nothing left to lose and violence branded into their souls. The implication hit the crowd like a physical blow. Wealthy merchants vomited over the marble railings. Former soldiers who'd laughed through 100 battles found their hands shaking. In the senators' section, Marcus Lepidus watched his wife among the victims below and bit through his own tongue to keep from screaming. What followed violated every Roman concept of justice, honor, and even creative cruelty. The intermission entertainment was about to begin. The criminals advanced on the women while Caligula provided commentary like a race announcer, noting technique and awarding points for creativity. Some victims tried to fight. Others froze completely, their minds refusing to process what was happening in front of 50,000 witnesses. The sand turned dark with more than blood. Children in the crowd began crying, their parents too stunned to comfort them. Several senators attempted to leave their seats only to find Praetorian guards blocking every exit. This was mandatory viewing for Rome's elite. An old centurion named Gaius Flavius had survived 40 years of frontier warfare. He'd held his shield wall against screaming Gauls and taken 3 arrows at the siege of Numantia without flinching. But watching a colleague's daughter subjected to public torture, while her father sat 3 rows away, broke something fundamental in him. He stood, his scarred hands gripping his seat's edge, and shouted a single word that cut through the horror. Enough. The arena fell silent except for victims' sobs. Every eye turned to see how the emperor would respond to this breach of protocol. Caligula smiled like a teacher pleased with a student's question. He ordered the old soldier brought to the arena floor. Flavius descended with the dignity of a man who'd already accepted death. his military bearing intact despite everything. The emperor offered him a choice: participate in the entertainment or join the women on the sand. The crowd held its breath. Even the criminals paused their assault, waiting to see if one of Rome's heroes would maintain his honor or surrender it for survival. Flavius spat on the sand and spoke loud enough for the furthest seats to hear. Rome had become a disease, he said. If this was what the empire meant now, he welcomed death. The old soldier began removing his toga, preparing to die as he'd lived, with courage. Several other veterans in the crowd started to stand in solidarity. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. One word from the emperor could turn admiration into revolution, or break the last illusion of Roman virtue forever. Instead, Caligula laughed and ordered the entertainment to continue. What happened next made hardened soldiers vomit into their hands. The criminals weren't just violating bodies anymore. Under the emperor's direction, they began forcing family members to participate in each other's degradation. Mothers and daughters. Sisters. The arena's acoustics, designed to carry death rattles to the cheap seats, now amplified sounds no amphitheatre was meant to contain. Some spectators fainted. Others sat in catatonic shock. But most remained frozen by the collective paralysis of witnessing evil so profound it seemed to stop time itself. A young woman managed to break free and ran for the arena wall. The crowd unconsciously leaned forward, some mad part of them hoping she might escape, might preserve some fragment of dignity. She made it halfway before a thrown spear caught her between the shoulders. As she fell, her last words carried clearly, "I am Julia Quinta, daughter of a consul." Even in death, she claimed her identity, refused to be reduced to mere flesh for the emperor's amusement. Her father sat motionless in the Senate section, tears streaming down his face. The spectacle continued for 3 full hours. By the end, the sand was so fouled it would need complete replacement. Several women lay unconscious or worse. The criminals themselves seemed diminished, their initial brutality replaced by mechanical movements, as if even they had found the limits of human cruelty. When Caligula finally called an end to the intermission, the normal gladiator matches still to come, the crowd's response was unprecedented in the history of Roman entertainment. Dead silence. 50,000 people filed out without a word. No arguments over the matches. No debates about technique. No wagering on the scheduled beast hunts. They moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with the particular expression of those who've seen something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. Vendors packed up their unsold goods. Bookmakers closed their tablets. Rome's greatest entertainment venue emptied as if evacuating before a plague. In the imperial box, Caligula watched his subjects flee with satisfaction. They'd learned an important lesson about the new nature of public space. And this was only the first of many innovations he planned for the games. The Senate met in emergency session that night, gathering in Marcellus's house rather than risk the official chambers. They spoke in whispers, afraid even their private homes might have ears. Some argued for immediate action, a military response before the emperor's madness infected the entire empire. Others counseled patience, hoping Caligula's excesses would burn themselves out. But Marcus Lepidus, whose wife remained in palace custody after surviving the arena, spoke the truth none wanted to acknowledge. They were already complicit. Their presence at the games, their failure to act, had made them participants in the horror. Word of the arena innovations spread through Rome's underworld faster than official proclamations. Criminals who'd spent lifetimes cultivating brutality found themselves disgusted. Even the handlers who trained beasts for the games, men who thought nothing of starving lions to increase their savagery, expressed revulsion. One animal trainer released all his stock and disappeared into the countryside rather than see his creatures used in whatever came next. The arena that had showcased Rome's martial might had become a symbol of its moral collapse. The immediate aftermath produced unexpected consequences throughout the city. Divorce applications flooded the courts as couples traumatized by what they'd witnessed together found they couldn't look at each other anymore. Physicians reported a surge in mysterious ailments, physical manifestations of psychological wounds. Several prominent families simply vanished overnight, abandoning properties held for generations rather than risk another summons to the games. The fabric of Roman society, already strained by 3 years of Caligula's rule, began showing visible tears. Yet even as Romans filed out in shocked silence, Caligula was already designing his masterpiece, a harem that would function as the empire's first systematic trauma factory. The screams were so precisely timed you could set your sundial by them. 3rd hour after dawn, the selection process. 5th hour, initial processing. By the 7th hour, the documentation phase produced its distinctive chorus of sobs. Caligula had transformed human suffering into a schedule as regular as the changing of the Praetorian Guard. The palace's east wing now housed an operation that required its own staff of scribes, guards, and what the emperor called his researchers. The selection criteria went far beyond physical beauty. Each potential victim underwent genealogical investigation that traced family connections back 3 generations. The scribes maintained detailed charts showing marriages, alliances, business partnerships. A senator who voted against imperial interests might find his brother's daughter summoned to the palace. A merchant who complained about new taxes discovered his wife's cousin on the selection list. The documentation revealed a mind that understood how to weaponize family bonds with mathematical precision. Claudia Pulchra learned about her selection while teaching her daughters to weave. The Praetorian messenger waited silently as she read the summons, watched her hands begin to shake, saw her glance toward her children. She had 48 hours to report to the palace's eastern entrance. The messenger noted her reaction on his tablet. Those who showed immediate fear rated higher on the emperor's interest scale. Those who tried to negotiate or offered bribes received special marks beside their names. Every response became data for the system. The intake process resembled a military census more than a brothel recruitment. Height, weight, distinguishing features, all recorded in triplicate. But the scribes also documented stranger details. Voice quality during stress. Physical responses to specific stimuli. Family members who might provide interesting leverage. One girl's file noted that her younger brother had just joined the Praetorian Guard. Another's mentioned her father's famous stoicism during torture by Germanic tribes. These weren't random observations. They were tools for customized psychological destruction. The documentation room occupied what had once been a temple to Vesta within the palace complex. The sacred flames had been extinguished, replaced by oil lamps that burned through the night, as scribes recorded each session in exhaustive detail. Position, duration, specific words spoken, physical responses, emotional breaking points. The emperor would review these reports each morning over breakfast, making notes in the margins, suggesting improvements. He approached trauma induction with the dedication of a scholar studying rhetoric. Each woman's file contained something even more disturbing than clinical records of assault. The researchers had developed a scoring system, points for different types of psychological collapse, bonuses for particularly creative methods of inducing specific responses, demerits when subjects became catatonic too quickly. The competitive element transformed palace guards into eager participants, each trying to outdo the others in extracting measurable suffering. Monthly rankings were posted in the guards' quarters. The winner received gold and an extra week's leave. The systematization of cruelty had found its perfect bureaucratic form. Family observation became mandatory for certain categories of victims. Husbands and fathers would receive summons to attend administrative meetings that led them through corridors ending at hidden viewing chambers. The architecture forced them to watch without being seen, to witness their loved one's degradation while remaining invisible, impotent, complicit. Some men tried to break through the walls. Others sat in perfect stillness, their minds fracturing with each scream. The scribes documented these reactions too, creating a secondary archive of collateral psychological damage. Marcus Calvus had been Rome's most decorated living general until the morning he was forced to watch his daughter's initiation into the emperor's collection. The man who'd held the line at Parthia, who'd earned the Corona Civica for saving an entire legion, sat behind reinforced glass as strangers reduced his child to numbered entries in a ledger. When he emerged 3 hours later, his hair had turned white. He never spoke again, communicating only through written notes for his remaining years. The scribes added his transformation to their files as a particularly successful outcome. The women who survived multiple sessions developed coping mechanisms that fascinated the emperor's researchers. Some retreated so deeply into their minds that their bodies became empty vessels, present but unreachable. Others fractured into multiple selves, presenting different personalities for different torments. A few learned to manipulate their tormentors, understanding that variation and novelty earned them brief respites. These adaptations were carefully documented and studied, used to develop new techniques for preventing such psychological escapes. The bureaucracy required to maintain this system employed more than 200 people: scribes to record, guards to transport, physicians to ensure victims remained functional, cleaners to erase the physical evidence, messengers to deliver summons, accountants to track expenses. Each played their role in the machinery of systematic horror, their participation ensuring their own family's safety. The emperor had created a self-perpetuating system where everyone from senator to slave had stakes in its continuation. But the real purpose of the documentation would soon become clear when foreign ambassadors began receiving copies of select files. The Parthian embassy had come to negotiate trade routes. They left with detailed accounts of what had happened to the previous ambassador's translator, a woman who'd made the mistake of catching the emperor's eye. The Germanic chieftains, seeking peace terms, received documentation showing the fates of hostages they'd sent as guarantees of good behavior. These weren't threats in any traditional sense. They were demonstrations of capability, promises of what awaited anyone who disappointed Rome's divine ruler. Diplomacy through systematized atrocity. The filing system grew to fill 3 rooms, then 5, then an entire palace wing. Cross-referenced by family name, physical characteristics, psychological profiles, and what the scribes euphemistically called performance metrics. A senator planning to oppose new legislation could pull his wife's file and see exactly what had been documented, what could be released, what shame would follow his family for generations. The archive became a weapon as powerful as any legion. Some women discovered their files had been updated with plans for future sessions they hadn't yet endured. Detailed descriptions of innovative approaches tailored to their specific psychological profiles. The anticipation often proved worse than the reality. Several victims took their own lives after reading what awaited them, their suicides carefully noted as evidence of successful pre-traumatic stress induction. The researchers considered this a breakthrough in efficiency, achieving desired psychological outcomes without direct physical intervention. The children born from these encounters received special documentation, separate files tracking their development, their potential usefulness, their psychological malleability. Some were raised in the palace, taught to see their mother's ongoing torment as normal entertainment. Others were placed with carefully selected families who understood their obligation to create future victims properly conditioned from birth. The emperor was building a generation that would consider systematic sexual violence as natural as gladiator games. What emerged from those rooms could never truly leave, their psyches permanently archived alongside their physical ordinations. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, the documentation center had processed over 3,000 women from every level of Roman society: senators' wives, merchants' daughters, priests' sisters, even female physicians and scholars who'd thought their professions might protect them. The files told the story of an empire's systematic violation, each entry a testament to how thoroughly one man's pathology could infect an entire civilization. The researchers estimated they could maintain current processing rates for another decade before exhausting Rome's supply of suitable victims. The psychological weapons created through this systematic trauma took many forms. Women released back to their families carried invisible wounds that destroyed marriages, shattered social networks, spread fear like a contagion. Some became instruments of the emperor's will, so thoroughly broken they'd help identify new victims to spare themselves return visits. Others retreated into madness, so complete their families had them declared legally dead rather than acknowledge what they'd become. Each outcome was documented, studied, refined into best practices for future application. A delegation of Egyptian priests arrived seeking restoration of temple privileges. They were escorted through the documentation center, shown the files of their predecessors who'd made similar requests. The priests departed without presenting their petition, but not before several of their acolytes had been added to the selection lists. The message spread throughout the Mediterranean. Rome's new god-emperor had industrialized divine wrath. Traditional deities tortured souls in the afterlife. Caligula had brought hell to earth and gave it filing systems. The night before the documentation center's expansion into its final form, a group of women marked for morning processing managed to break into the archive rooms. They didn't try to destroy their own files. Instead, they read them aloud to each other, bearing witness to each other's documented suffering, reclaiming their stories from the clinical language of bureaucratic horror. When guards found them at dawn, they'd used their own blood to add final entries to their files. Curses, promises, warnings. The scribes dutifully transcribed these additions, missing the significance of women writing themselves into history on their own terms. Having perfected trauma as a tool, Caligula set his sights on the one institution Romans still trusted. Their gods were about to become his accomplices. The priest's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the sacred oils as Caligula commanded him to bless what was about to happen. The trembling wasn't from age or cold, but from the knowledge that he was about to consecrate acts that would make the gods themselves turn away in disgust. Oil dripped between his fingers onto marble that had once known only offerings of wine and grain. Now it would witness something else entirely. The emperor stood beside him, purple toga arranged with ceremonial precision, waiting for divine approval of horrors that no prayer had ever contemplated. Around them, 12 other priests formed a circle in Jupiter's most sacred temple. Their faces showed the particular exhaustion of men who'd performed this ritual too many times. Each clutched ceremonial implements that their order had protected for centuries, holy objects about to be perverted into props for imperial theatre. The youngest among them, barely past his initiation, wept openly as he prepared the altar. His tears fell on bronze fixtures installed just that morning, restraint points disguised as decorative elements. The victim had already been selected. Senator Quintus's daughter, 17 years old, chosen specifically because her family maintained the old religious traditions. She knelt between 2 Praetorian guards, wearing the white robes of a virgin offering to Minerva. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Caligula had spent weeks preparing this particular blasphemy, consulting ancient texts to ensure every detail inverted sacred tradition. Where custom demanded willing sacrifice, he would demonstrate divine endorsement of violation. The emperor raised his arms in mock supplication. His voice echoed off temple walls that had heard 10,000 prayers but never words like these. He called upon Jupiter to witness, upon Mars to strengthen, upon Venus to bless what would follow with divine pleasure. Each invocation twisted traditional formulas into grotesque parodies. The priests were required to respond with ritual phrases, their voices cracking as they spoke blessings over planned atrocity. What happened next would haunt even those who'd grown numb to palace horrors. The high priest was commanded to anoint the guards who would carry out the assault. The old man's entire body rebelled against the order. His hands froze above the sacred oil. His lips refused to form the words. 40 years of devotion to Jupiter battled against the immediate threat of death. The temple fell silent except for the girl's rapid breathing and the distant sound of city traffic beyond sacred walls. Everyone waited to see if religious authority would finally find its spine or surrender like every other Roman institution. Caligula's response transformed a moment of defiance into something worse. He wouldn't threaten the priest. Instead, he began listing the names of every acolyte who served in the temple, their ages, their families, their potential usefulness in palace entertainment. The meaning was clear. Refuse, and watch your entire religious community fed into the machinery of imperial appetite. The high priest's resistance crumbled. His shaking hands completed the anointing. Jupiter's own representative had just blessed the defilement of innocence. The ritual proceeded with nauseating precision, each traditional element carefully corrupted. Where incense should burn, they lit fires of documentation from previous victims. Where wine should pour, they used substances that made the priests gag. Where prayers should rise, the emperor provided running commentary on divine pleasure in mortal suffering. The guards prepared for their sanctified task, while the girl's white robes were marked with religious symbols that would transform her violation into sacred act. Her father sat in the Senate section of the temple, forced to attend this special ceremony. Quintus had survived 20 years of political intrigue, navigated the madness of 3 emperors, kept his family safe through careful compromise. Now he watched his daughter become the centerpiece of theological rape, while priests he'd known since childhood provided divine sanction. His famous stoicism, the quality that had earned him consulships and military commands, shattered like pottery against marble. The sound he made wasn't quite a scream, more like the noise of a soul tearing loose from its moorings. The corruption of the temples went even deeper than forced ceremonies. Caligula had installed his own priests in key positions. These weren't men of faith, but specialists recruited from the palace interrogation chambers. They understood how to break minds through spiritual warfare. Where traditional priests offered comfort and guidance, these impostors provided customized theological torture. They told wives that submitting to imperial summons was divine will. They convinced children that their parents' suffering was payment for sin. They transformed Rome's religious foundation into another weapon in the emperor's arsenal. The new priests received special training in victim preparation. They would visit selected families days before palace summons arrived, planting seeds of religious doubt. Perhaps the gods were angry. Perhaps sacrifice was needed. Perhaps what seemed like horror was actually divine testing. By the time Praetorian guards arrived, victims had been spiritually softened, their faith transformed from shield into vulnerability. Some actually thanked the emperor for choosing them to suffer, believing their pain served cosmic purpose. One innovation particularly delighted the emperor: forced confessions in sacred space. Women would be brought to temples and made to declare their own corruption before the altars, to beg for the cleansing only imperial attention could provide. Priests would solemnly record these coerced admissions, filing them with temple records that had once tracked legitimate offerings and answered prayers. Future generations would read these archives and find testimony of willing participation where only terrorized compliance existed. The smaller cults suffered even worse fates. The followers of Isis, with their emphasis on female divine power, found their goddess recast as celestial procuress. Their sacred mysteries, carefully guarded for centuries, were perverted into initiation rites for the palace collection. The Mithraic chambers, where soldiers once found spiritual strength, became venues for forcing military wives to perform while their husbands' legion standards watched. Every faith that Romans had built for comfort found itself conscripted into service of systematic degradation. Sacred festivals became hunting seasons. During the Bacchanalia, when religious ecstasy traditionally blurred social boundaries, the emperor's agents would circulate through crowds, marking targets. The spring rites of Ceres turned into mass selection events where young women presenting first fruits at the altar might find themselves harvested for other purposes. The October horse, meant to ensure military victory, now included rituals where generals' wives were forced to couple with cavalry mounts, while priests declared it necessary for Rome's protection. Traditional joy transformed into anticipated terror as religious calendars became schedules for imperial predation. The psychological damage spread far beyond direct victims. Romans had always found strength in their gods, comfort in their rituals, community in their shared beliefs. Now, every prayer carried the possibility of perverse attention. Every visit to a temple risked notice by corrupted priests who reported back to the palace. Parents stopped bringing children to religious ceremonies. The faithful prayed at home shrines rather than risk public worship. The threads connecting Roman society to its divine protectors frayed with each blasphemous innovation. Some priests tried to maintain true faith in secret. They would perform real blessings after the corrupted ones, hoping to somehow cleanse what had been polluted. These men risked everything to preserve some fragment of authentic religious practice. When discovered, their punishment served as public demonstration of divine displeasure with resistance. One priest who tried to perform proper funeral rites for a victim was crucified upside down in his own temple. His death agonies declared a new form of prayer to the emperor's divinity. The ultimate corruption came when Caligula declared himself not just divine but superior to the traditional gods. He ordered his statue placed in every temple, positioned to oversee all ceremonies. But these weren't typical imperial images. The statues depicted him in various states of sexual conquest, his divine masculinity literally overshadowing the older deities. Priests were required to begin every ceremony by acknowledging his superior potency, The gods themselves had been reduced to supporting cast in the emperor's theological pornography. What he did during the harvest festival would haunt Rome forever, as even the season's abundance became an offering to imperial depravity. The autumn air carried smoke from burning fields as farmers brought their best grain to Rome for the October celebrations. The harvest festival had always been a time of joy and gratitude, when the city's marble hardness softened with rural warmth. Families who rarely left their neighborhoods would travel to the Campus Martius to see the ceremonies, to thank Ceres for another year's survival. Children ran between the temporary altars, while their parents shared wine and compared crops. Even the poorest citizens could feel abundance during these 3 days, when custom demanded generosity. Caligula had spent months preparing his transformation of the harvest rites. The plans required such specific coordination that he created a special administrative position just to oversee the details. This year's festival would demonstrate that even Rome's most innocent traditions existed only at imperial pleasure. The corruption would be so complete that future generations might forget celebrations had ever meant anything but fear. The preparatory orders went out in sealed scrolls, their contents known only to those who would implement them. The first day proceeded normally, deliberately so. Farmers presented their grain offerings. Priests performed traditional blessings. Families spread blankets for outdoor feasts. The only unusual element was the number of Praetorian guards stationed around the celebration grounds. Citizens noticed, but assumed it was standard security for imperial attendance. They should have paid attention to which units had been deployed. These weren't regular palace guards, but specialists transferred from the documentation center. As sunset approached on the second day, the emperor appeared on the main platform wearing robes that mimicked traditional priestly garments but in imperial purple. He announced a new ritual to guarantee next year's fertility. The crowd fell silent with the particular quality of those who'd learned that imperial innovations meant suffering. Parents instinctively pulled children closer. Young women tried to fade into family groups. Everyone waited to discover what price the harvest would exact this year. The selection began with choreographed efficiency. Guards moved through the crowd, identifying maidens between 15 and 25. Not randomly, but following lists prepared weeks in advance. Daughters of families who'd shown insufficient enthusiasm for imperial policies. Sisters of men who'd hesitated when called to serve. Nieces of merchants who'd complained about grain taxes. Each selection served multiple purposes, removing potential dissidents while demonstrating the futility of any resistance. The chosen ones were separated from their families and herded toward the platform like livestock at market. One father, a grain merchant named Titus, tried to substitute himself for his daughter. He offered his entire warehouse, his fortune, his own life. The guards noted his name for future attention, but continued their collection. A mother threw herself at a Praetorian's feet, begging in the old language of the countryside. Her pleas might have moved stones to weep. The guards stepped over her as if she were debris. The crowd's horror transformed into paralysis as they realized intervention would only add names to the lists. On the platform, corrupted priests had prepared special altars. These weren't the traditional stone blocks, but furniture transferred from the palace, still bearing stains that told their own stories. The emperor explained that fertile fields required fertile demonstrations. The gods of harvest demanded seeds be planted in full view of their worshippers. His words perverted agricultural metaphors into obscenities that made farmers cover their ears. But blocking out sound couldn't prevent what their eyes would witness. The planting ceremony proceeded with ritualistic precision. Each maiden was assigned to a different altar, attended by priests who chanted corrupted fertility prayers. The emperor moved between stations like a farmer, inspecting crops, offering suggestions, demanding improvements. The crowd of 10,000 stood frozen as their daughters became unwilling. Earth mothers, in a ceremony that transformed natural abundance into orchestrated violation. Some families tried to leave only to find every exit blocked. This was mandatory worship at the altar of imperial appetite. The screams mixed with traditional harvest songs in a cacophony that defined the new Rome. Children who'd come to see puppet shows and taste honey cakes instead received education in how power could transform any joy into horror. Their parents stood helpless, forced to choose between teaching them to accept atrocity or revealing their own impotence. Many covered young eyes but couldn't block young ears. The sounds would echo in nightmares for a generation, creating citizens who'd flinch at harvest time for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Marcus Aurelius Cotta had been Rome's chief augur for 20 years. He'd interpreted the flights of birds to predict victories and read the entrails of sacrifices to guide Senate decisions. Now he stood on the platform, his white robes splattered with evidence of the new divination. The emperor had ordered him to read omens in the victims' responses, to divine next year's harvest from their cries. The old priest's mind simply stopped functioning. He began reciting children's nursery rhymes in place of sacred formulas, his sanity a casualty of forced participation. The festival's final day brought the worst innovation. Caligula announced that the seeds planted required proper cultivation. The victims' families were brought forward and made to thank the emperor for ensuring future prosperity. Each parent had to speak ritual words of gratitude while their daughters lay broken on the harvest altars. Those who refused found themselves added to the ceremony. The perversion of natural bonds became performance art, with the crowd forced to applaud each statement of appreciation or risk selection themselves. Word of the harvest festival transformation spread through the countryside faster than any plague. Farming communities that had celebrated the same rites for centuries abandoned them overnight. Fields went unblessed rather than risk attracting imperial attention. The autumn offerings that had bound rural and urban Rome together became another casualty of systematic horror. Gods of grain and growth found their temples empty as people decided starvation was preferable to the new forms of worship. As priests wept over their defiled altars, one person finally snapped. Drusilla had endured 3 years of her brother's attention without breaking, but the harvest festival shattered her last defense. The emperor's beloved sister, his most prized possession, the only person whose pain he savored slowly rather than consuming in gulps, had watched him transform every sacred thing into pornographic theatre. She'd survived palace horrors through dissociation, through the particular madness that made endurance possible. But seeing him corrupt the innocent festivals of her childhood, the ceremonies where their mother had once held their hands, broke through her carefully constructed walls. The morning after the harvest festival, slaves found Drusilla in her chambers surrounded by shattered mirrors. She'd spent the night destroying every reflective surface, unable to bear seeing what she'd become. Her body showed the particular exhaustion of someone who'd fought a losing battle with their own existence. When Caligula arrived for his morning visit, she was conscious but unreachable, her mind having finally found the escape her body couldn't achieve. The emperor's fury at losing his favorite toy would reshape Rome's religious landscape into even darker configurations. She spoke only once more before retreating completely into catatonic silence. As her brother raged about calling the finest physicians, about forcing the gods themselves to restore her responsiveness, Drusilla looked through him as if he were mist. Her words came out cracked but clear, audible to every slave and guard present. She thanked him for showing her that the gods were dead, that Rome's prayers reached only empty skies, that the only divine truth was suffering without meaning. Then she closed her eyes and never acknowledged the world again. Caligula's response to losing Drusilla would transform grief into citywide horror. But first, he had to punish the gods themselves for failing to keep his favorite toy functional. Every priest who'd blessed his actions would learn that divine sanction meant nothing when the god-emperor felt betrayed. The temples that had been forced to enable his appetites were about to discover that collaboration brought no protection from imperial rage. The corruption of Rome's holiest spaces had reached its crescendo, and the gods themselves seemed to abandon their altars rather than witness what worship had become. The funeral pyre crackled with cedar and myrrh, flames reaching towards stars that seemed dimmer since Drusilla stopped breathing. Caligula circled the burning platform like a predator stalking prey that had already escaped. His purple toga dragged through ash and offering wine as he muttered arguments with someone who could no longer hear them. The senators forced to attend shifted uncomfortably in their ceremonial whites, watching their emperor negotiate with smoke and memory. 3 days. That's how long the physicians had tried to revive her after she retreated into herself. The emperor had threatened to crucify them all if they failed. He'd promised rewards beyond imagination if they succeeded. Neither approach could restore what systematic trauma had finally broken. When her heart stopped on the third dawn, Slaves reported Caligula's scream shattered wine jugs 3 rooms away. The crowd of mourners stood in careful formation, their faces arranged in expressions of profound grief. Not for the dead girl, but for themselves. They understood the mathematics of imperial loss. When Tiberius had lost favorites, dozens died to keep them company in the afterlife. Caligula's attachment to Drusilla went deeper than mere possession. She'd been his masterwork, 3 years of conditioning, creating responses no other victim could replicate. Her death meant someone would pay the price for depriving a god of his most treasured offering. Marcus Lepidus watched the pyre consume the woman he'd once hoped to marry before her brother claimed exclusive rights. He remembered Drusilla at 14, brilliant and defiant, arguing philosophy with scholars twice her age. The flames now devoured something else entirely. A body that had survived horrors that killed others through shock alone. A mind that had found the only escape the emperor couldn't block. Lepidus felt relief for her mixed with terror for what came next. The emperor suddenly stopped his circling, his eyes fixed on a senator's wife who'd let her ritual wailing falter for a moment. The calculation in his expression made everyone resume their demonstrations of grief with renewed intensity. Women tore their hair with genuine enthusiasm. Men beat their chests hard enough to leave bruises. The performance of mourning became competitive as each citizen tried to outgrieve their neighbors, understanding that insufficient sorrow equaled treason. Gaius Silius made the fatal error of authentic emotion. The young senator had known Drusilla before her brother's appetites transformed her. When flames reached her face, he turned away, unable to watch beauty become ash. That single moment of human weakness sealed his fate. Caligula's voice cut through the ceremonial wailing, noting that some seemed insufficiently moved by divine loss. Guards moved toward Silius before the emperor even finished speaking. The executions for inadequate mourning began that very night. Silius died first, forced to drink molten gold because his grief hadn't been worth its weight in precious metal. His wife followed, buried alive with scrolls of love poetry Drusilla had written in happier times. The message spread through Rome's elite, like blood through water. The emperor's pain required company, and he would manufacture it from anyone who failed to mirror his theatrical suffering. Public mourning became mandatory throughout the empire. Theatres closed. Laughter in the streets earned immediate arrest. A baker who smiled while kneading bread found his ovens used for purposes that had nothing to do with baking. The whole city performed grief while secretly celebrating that the emperor's favorite victim could no longer be used to demonstrate new innovations in systematic horror. Even relief had to hide behind masks of sorrow. Caligula ordered statues of Drusilla erected in every temple, depicting her as Venus. These weren't idealized divine forms, but anatomically precise recreations showing marks his attention had left. Priests were required to make offerings to these images of documented damage. Citizens had to kiss the marble scars during religious ceremonies. The sculptors who'd been forced to create these monuments drank themselves to death rather than sign their work. The emperor's nights grew worse without his constructed companion. He would summon women who resembled Drusilla, then rage when they failed to respond correctly. 3 years of conditioning couldn't be replicated through simple violence. The specific sounds she'd learned to make, the precise muscular responses trained through repetition, the perfectly calibrated reactions that had made her irreplaceable. Each failure drove him to greater extremes, trying to force equivalence through escalating brutality. One night, he commanded the palace musicians to recreate Drusilla's sounds from memory. The performers sat with their instruments, ordered to compose a symphony of suffering based on what they'd overheard from her chambers. The resulting cacophony made listeners vomit. Stringed instruments mimicked screams. Drums replicated impacts. Wind instruments reproduced the particular breathing patterns of sustained trauma. When the composition finished, half the musicians were executed for getting the notes wrong. The search for replacement became increasingly desperate. He had genealogists trace Drusilla's bloodline, seeking distant cousins who might share her capacity for endurance. Young women throughout Italy found themselves measured against impossible standards. Height within half an inch. Voice pitched to match recordings the scribes had made. Even the way they flinched when struck had to mirror patterns documented in her files. None satisfied. The emperor's frustration grew with each failed audition. These sessions produced their own casualties beyond the rejected candidates. Guards who'd developed specific techniques for Drusilla found themselves unable to replicate results. Scribes couldn't document responses that matched their carefully maintained records. The entire system, built around one perfectly conditioned victim, began collapsing without its centerpiece. What had been precise became chaotic. What had been systematic became random violence. Cornelia thought she'd found safety in obscurity. A merchant's daughter from the Suburra, too poor for noble attention, too common for imperial interest, until someone noticed her hands moved like Drusilla's when she was frightened. That single similarity earned her a summons that her family knew meant death, just slower. Her father spent their life savings on passage to Britannia, choosing exile over watching his daughter become raw material for impossible replication. The Emperor's methods grew more extreme as his frustration mounted. Victims were forced to study Drusilla's files, to memorize her documented responses, to practice reproducing sounds they'd never heard. The palace became a demented theatre school, where failure to perform meant death. Women who'd survived previous attention found themselves recalled for remedial training. The systematic horror that had once followed careful plans devolved into frantic improvisation. Private traders began selling protective charms, claiming to make women unsuitable for imperial attention. Scars inflicted to destroy resemblance. Voices deliberately damaged to avoid matching recordings. Parents paid surgeons to alter daughters' appearances, choosing disfigurement over selection. The lengths citizens went to avoid notice revealed how thoroughly one death had destabilized an entire system of abuse. But Caligula's grief took its most disturbing form in what happened to Drusilla's body before the pyre. Even death couldn't protect her from her brother's twisted affections. The embalmers later required purification rituals that priests had never performed before. They spoke in whispers about preparations that violated every funeral custom, about demands that made them question whether the emperor understood death as a boundary. 3 of them abandoned their profession entirely, unable to practice their craft after what they'd been forced to do. Their tools were burned rather than cleaned, as if the metal itself had been contaminated beyond salvage. What he did with her corpse during those 3 days shocked even hardened palace guards. They stood outside the preparation chamber listening to sounds that shouldn't exist in rooms containing the dead. The emperor emerged at intervals, his toga stained with funeral oils and other substances, demanding different implements, specific preservation techniques that served no legitimate purpose. He seemed convinced that proper preparation could restore what his attention had finally broken. The funeral rites themselves became another performance of perversion. Traditional ceremonies twisted into demonstrations that death meant as little as consent in the emperor's universe. He insisted on rituals from mystery cults, from foreign religions, from practices so ancient even scholars couldn't verify their authenticity. Each element selected to maintain connection with what shouldn't be touched. The priests who officiated required spiritual cleansing that lasted months. On the second night of public mourning, something shifted in the city's atmosphere. The enforced grief had created unexpected solidarity among citizens who'd previously viewed each other as competitors for survival. Shared performance of false sorrow revealed shared exhaustion with authentic horror. In taverns where laughter was forbidden, men communicated through glances. In markets where smiles meant death, women developed coded languages of resistance. Drusilla's death had accidentally created space for something dangerous to grow. Marcus Aurelius Cotta, driven mad during the harvest festival, experienced a moment of terrible clarity during the funeral. The former priest stood among the mourners, his broken mind suddenly understanding what others couldn't yet see. The emperor's perfect victim was gone. Without her, his carefully constructed system would consume itself. The very specificity of his obsession had created a weakness. He whispered his revelation to those nearby, before guards dragged him away. His words spread through the crowd like seeds finding fertile soil. The transformation in Caligula's methods became apparent within days. Where calculated cruelty had once followed careful plans, random violence erupted without pattern. He ordered executions for reasons he couldn't articulate. He demanded innovations his specialists couldn't deliver. The machinery of systematic horror, built around one irreplaceable component, ground against itself, producing heat, but no results. Even monsters require method, and his had died with Drusilla. The aristocrats forced to witness the funeral rites carried home more than trauma. They'd seen the emperor's vulnerability, his dependence on specific responses that couldn't be replicated. They'd watched a god rage against mortality and lose. In careful conversations behind locked doors, they began discussing possibilities that Drusilla's breathing presence had made unthinkable. If the emperor's perfect creation could escape through death, perhaps the creator himself wasn't as invulnerable as claimed. As the funeral pyre finally collapsed into embers, Caligula commanded the ashes be collected in vessels of gold and crystal. He would visit these containers daily, speaking to them as if they contained more than burnt bone and carbon. Sometimes guards heard him pleading, other times threatening. Once, they found him trying to reshape the ashes into human form, his hands black with the residue of absolute loss. Even gods, it seemed, could be broken by absence. The death of Drusilla marked the end of systematic horror and the beginning of chaotic terror. Without his masterpiece to demonstrate the artistry of abuse, Caligula's methods became crude, desperate, searching for impact rather than effect. He'd spent years creating the perfect victim only to discover that perfection, by definition, couldn't be replaced. The empire held its breath, waiting to see what form his frustrated grief would take. With his favorite toy broken beyond repair, Caligula's methods became increasingly desperate, and an entire empire was about to learn what happens when a god throws a tantrum. The palace baker hadn't been touched by Caligula, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't knead dough. Each morning he'd arrive before dawn to prepare bread for the imperial table, and each morning his trembling grew worse. The flour scattered across marble countertops like ash from funeral pyres. His assistants noticed but said nothing. They had their own shaking to hide. The kitchen staff developed a shared language of glances and gestures, communicating warnings without words. A particular way of dropping a ladle meant guards were approaching. 2 taps on a pot signaled someone had been summoned upstairs. They moved through their duties like dancers avoiding invisible obstacles, each aware that proximity to horror could prove as dangerous as direct contact. The symptoms spread from person to person without any physical touch required. Marcus, the wine steward, hadn't slept properly in months. Not since the night he'd been ordered to remain in the dining hall during one of the emperor's special banquets. He'd stood against the wall for 3 hours, refilling cups while trying not to see what happened on the couches. Now, every time he closed his eyes, the scenes replayed with perfect clarity. His wife found him scrubbing his hands raw at midnight, trying to clean away memories that lived beneath the skin. The laundry women bore different scars. They'd handled the aftermath, sorting through stained garments that told stories no one wanted to read. Some fabrics came to them still warm, still carrying the salt of tears, and worse. They'd developed a system of burning certain items rather than attempting to clean them. The smoke from their fires carried a particular smell that made passing slaves quicken their steps. Everyone in the palace knew that scent meant another session had concluded. Even the marble seemed contaminated. Slaves tasked with cleaning floors reported that some stains wouldn't fade no matter how hard they scrubbed. The stone itself appeared to absorb trauma, developing discolorations in patterns that suggested human forms. One corridor near the documentation rooms had to be abandoned entirely after 3 cleaning slaves were found catatonic beside their buckets, their minds broken by whatever the walls had witnessed. But the servants weren't the only ones showing symptoms. In the Senate House, proceedings ground to a halt as members struggled with basic functions. Senator Flavius, known for his powerful oratory, found himself unable to complete sentences when discussing certain topics. His voice would simply stop, as if invisible hands squeezed his throat. Other senators developed facial tics that emerged whenever legislation touched on palace matters. The collective trauma manifested in shared involuntary responses, turning Rome's governing body into a chorus of nervous habits. The merchants in the forum noticed changes in their customers' behavior. Wealthy matrons who'd once haggled over prices now paid whatever was asked, their minds too occupied with other worries to care about household expenses. Young women shopped in groups, never venturing out alone, their eyes constantly scanning for purple togas or military cloaks. Even routine transactions became fraught with unspoken anxiety, as everyone wondered who might be watching, who might report casual conversations to palace informants. Children absorbed the fear through their parents' changed behavior. They learned not to laugh too loudly, not to run too fast, not to draw attention in any way. Playgrounds fell silent as games became whispered affairs. Teachers reported students flinching at unexpected movements, crying without apparent cause, developing nightmares about monsters wearing imperial purple. An entire generation was learning that safety was an illusion adults could no longer maintain. The physicians of Rome found themselves treating conditions their training hadn't prepared them for. Patients arrived with racing hearts but no physical cause. Women lost their voices despite healthy throats. Men developed paralysis in limbs that showed no injury. The symptoms defied traditional remedies because the sickness lived in experiences rather than flesh. Some doctors began keeping separate records, documenting this new plague that spread through witnessing rather than contact. What happened in the Senate that day changed everything. It started when Senator Gallus collapsed during a routine discussion of grain distribution. He'd been mid-sentence when his body began convulsing, not from poison or seizure but from memories triggered by seemingly innocent words. As colleagues rushed to help, his thrashing knocked over the speaker's podium. The crash echoed through the chamber like thunder, and suddenly Gallus wasn't the only one showing symptoms. Senator after senator began displaying signs of the invisible contagion. Macro, the Praetorian prefect, watched from the visitors' gallery as Rome's most powerful men were reduced to shaking wrecks by their own minds. He'd seen soldiers break under torture, had overseen interrogations that pushed human endurance past all limits. But this was different. These men were destroying themselves from within, their bodies rebelling against memories they couldn't escape. The empire's leadership was disintegrating without a single blow being struck. The session had to be abandoned as more senators succumbed to various manifestations of trauma. Some froze completely, unable to move or speak. Others couldn't stop talking, words pouring out in desperate streams as if silence might invite worse memories. A few simply walked out, abandoning positions they'd spent decades achieving, rather than remain in a building where they'd been forced to vote approval for horrors they'd witnessed. News of the Senate's breakdown spread through Rome within hours. If the empire's leaders couldn't function, what hope did ordinary citizens have? Shops closed early as owners decided any business wasn't worth potential notice. The great baths emptied as people avoided gathering in groups. The very air in Rome seemed poisoned with fear, making each breath an act of courage. The temples, already corrupted by enforced ceremonies, became centers of a different kind of suffering. Citizens arrived seeking comfort only to find priests as traumatized as their flocks. Prayers turned into group expressions of barely controlled hysteria. The traditional Roman stoicism cracked like pottery under pressure, revealing the raw terror beneath. Some temples simply locked their doors rather than attempt services that dissolved into collective breakdowns. One young priest named Quintus tried to maintain normal services at the Temple of Vesta. He'd managed to avoid the worst of the corrupted ceremonies, protected by his duties tending the sacred flame. But even he couldn't escape the contagion entirely. Petitioners arrived carrying invisible wounds that infected everyone nearby. Their confessions painted pictures that transformed his sanctuary into another space where horror lived. He found himself adding extra oil to the eternal flame, as if more light might drive away the darkness that seemed to seep from the very stones. The gladiator schools reported unprecedented problems. Men who'd faced death countless times in the arena were having nightmares about palace summons. They'd rather fight lions than risk attention from purple-cloaked messengers. Training sessions devolved into chaos as fighters confused combat sounds with other noises they'd heard. Several top gladiators simply disappeared, choosing life as fugitives over fame that might bring them to imperial notice. Among the patrician families, the contagion took refined forms. Dinner parties became minefields of potential triggers. A wrong word, an inadvertent gesture, could send entire tables into stunned silence. Hosts learned to avoid certain topics entirely. Discussions of politics, religion, even weather, might spiral into dangerous territory. The art of conversation, so central to Roman social life, withered as everyone practiced the safer skill of saying nothing. Young men of military age developed mysterious ailments that prevented service. The recruitment officers saw through these manufactured disabilities but often looked the other way. They had their own reasons for wanting fewer soldiers in a system where loyalty might mean participating in horrors that violated every military code. The legions that had once conquered the world were filling with men already broken before their first battle. The economic effects rippled outward from the traumatized center. Businesses failed as owners lost the ability to make decisions, paralyzed by fears of attracting notice. Trade routes shifted to avoid Rome entirely, merchants choosing longer journeys over entering a city, where commerce might lead to conscription for palace entertainment. The great markets that had fed an empire began to empty as both sellers and buyers found other places to conduct essential business. Artists and entertainers faced impossible choices. Their livelihoods depended on public performance, but visibility had become synonymous with danger. Some developed acts of such aggressive mediocrity that they couldn't possibly attract imperial interest. Others abandoned their crafts entirely, choosing poverty over the risk of being too good at bringing pleasure. The creative heart of Rome was learning to beat as quietly as possible. The corruption spread to professions that should have remained neutral. Secretaries developed trembling hands that made writing difficult. Accountants found themselves unable to concentrate on figures, their minds wandering to dangerous territories. Even the men who cleaned the public latrines reported symptoms, as if the entire city was contaminating itself through shared fear. In the poorest districts, where imperial attention rarely fell directly, the effects manifested differently. These people couldn't afford to stop working, couldn't retreat to country estates, couldn't hide behind walls. They absorbed the trauma through 1,000 small channels. The bread they bought was baked by trembling hands. The wine they drank was served by men who'd seen too much. Their children played in streets where screams had become background noise. The very architecture of Rome began reflecting the psychological damage. Buildings stood empty because no one could bear to enter spaces where horrors had occurred. Certain streets were abandoned to beggars and ghosts. The efficient Roman urban planning that had been the envy of the world was being reshaped by invisible boundaries, places where memories made normal life impossible. As trauma spread through Rome like a plague, one man's breaking point was approaching. Cassius Chaerea had endured the final humiliation that would transform a loyal soldier into an assassin. The password Caligula assigned his guard that night was Venus, a final mockery of the masculinity he'd spent years destroying. Cassius Chaerea stood at his post, jaw clenched as fellow soldiers snickered behind their helmets. 3 years of this. 3 years of passwords like Priapus and Ganymede, each one calculated to remind the veteran tribune that his emperor saw him as something less than a man. The leather grip of his gladius had worn smooth from his clenching fist during these nightly humiliations. The other guards pretended not to notice Chaerea's rage anymore. They'd grown used to the way his neck flushed purple when delivering the evening passwords, how his voice cracked on certain syllables. Some felt sympathy for the old soldier who'd served with distinction under Germanicus. Others simply thanked the gods it wasn't them chosen for special mockery. The emperor had a talent for finding each man's breaking point, and Chaerea's had something to do with the high pitch of his voice. Chaerea's humiliation had started small, a joke about his voice during morning briefings, comments about how he sounded like a eunuch when shouting commands. Then came the passwords, each more degrading than the last. Sweet lips, rosebud, silken. The emperor would watch Chaerea's face as he assigned them, feeding on the veteran's barely controlled fury. What made it worse was the laughter from men Chaerea had trained, soldiers who'd once followed him through Germanic forests, now giggling at his debasement. The systematic destruction of Chaerea's dignity served a larger purpose. Caligula understood that breaking a respected officer meant breaking the entire guard's sense of honor. If a hero of the Rhine campaigns could be reduced to a joke, what protection did anyone have? The younger guards learned to laugh on cue, to participate in their tribune's humiliation rather than risk becoming the next target. The Praetorian Guard, once Rome's most elite unit, was transforming into a collection of broken men held together by shared shame. Other officers suffered their own specialized torments. Cornelius Sabinus endured constant jokes about his wife, whom the emperor had used repeatedly before returning her pregnant and broken. Marcus Vinicius was forced to wear perfume during his shifts, the scent attracting wasps in summer and marking him for ridicule year-round. Each degradation was carefully chosen, personalized to cut deepest. The emperor kept notes on which humiliations produced the best reactions, refining his techniques like a scholar studying rhetoric. Sabinus had been planning revenge for months before approaching Cherea. The two men first spoke in the bathhouse, steam providing cover for treasonous whispers. They discovered they weren't alone in their hatred. Other guards had been keeping mental lists of grievances, waiting for someone brave enough to speak first. The conspiracy grew slowly, each new member vetted through shared stories of humiliation. By winter, 13 Praetorians had sworn oaths on their ancestors' shades to end the emperor's reign. The secret meetings took place in a forgotten shrine to Mars beneath the barracks. They gathered by candlelight, planning in voices barely above whispers. Each man brought intelligence from their posts, guard rotations, palace layouts, the emperor's daily routines. They studied Caligula's movements, like hunters tracking prey, noting when he was most vulnerable, when his divine delusions made him careless. The plan took shape slowly, carefully, with the patience of men who knew they'd only get one chance. Cherea emerged as the natural leader, not through ambition but through the depth of his rage. While others wavered, wondering if assassination was too extreme, he never doubted. The passwords had been merely the final insult in a longer campaign. He'd been forced to escort victims to the emperor's chambers, to stand outside listening, to see what remained when the doors finally opened. Each horror had carved away another piece of the soldier he'd once been until only the need for vengeance remained. The conspirators faced a unique problem. Previous assassinations had been palace affairs, senators hiring killers, or family members poisoning wine. This required coordination between multiple armed men in broad daylight. They couldn't simply attack in the emperor's chambers, where escape routes were limited and loyalist guards might interfere. The killing had to be public enough that no one could deny it happened, but private enough to avoid immediate retaliation. They needed a space that balanced visibility with vulnerability. Recruitment expanded beyond the Praetorian ranks. Senators who'd lost wives and daughters proved eager to provide funding and intelligence. Freedmen, who'd served in the palace, shared architectural details. Even some of Caligula's personal slaves offered assistance, their loyalty eroded by years of witnessing horrors. The conspiracy became a shadow government. Men from every level of society, united by shared hatred of what Rome had become. The planning sessions revealed the depth of damage Caligula had inflicted. As conspirators shared their motivations, stories emerged that made even hardened soldiers weep. Fathers who'd been forced to watch. Husbands who'd been made to participate. Brothers who'd found their sisters among the palace documentation. Each tale added weight to their resolve. This wasn't just about removing a bad emperor anymore. This was about reclaiming their souls from someone who'd turned shame into state policy. Security proved challenging as the conspiracy grew. Too many people knowing too much created opportunities for betrayal. They developed codes within codes, backup plans for backup plans. If one group was discovered, others would continue independently. The assassination wasn't just one plot, but dozens of overlapping schemes, each capable of succeeding alone. They were building redundancy into regicide. Tensions emerged within the group over methods. Some wanted to make the death as painful as possible, to repay suffering with suffering. Others argued for efficiency, a quick death that removed the threat without sinking to the emperor's level. Cherea settled the debate with soldiers' logic. The goal was certainty, not satisfaction. They would strike repeatedly, ensuring death, but wouldn't waste time on theatrics. They were exterminators, not torturers. The date selection required careful consideration. It couldn't be during major festivals when crowds might interfere. It needed to be a day when the emperor followed predictable routines but wasn't surrounded by unusual security. They settled on the Palatine Games in January, when Caligula would move between venues through underground passages. The Cryptoporticus offered the perfect combination of isolation and inevitability. As planning intensified, the conspirators noticed changes in each other. Men who'd been broken by humiliation were finding strength in shared purpose. The act of plotting restored dignity that years of degradation had stolen. They stood straighter, spoke clearer, looked directly at the emperor during his mockeries. Some worried this new confidence might give them away. Others felt it was worth the risk to feel like soldiers again. The final insult came in January when Caligula assigned Chaerea the password Venus for what would be the last time. The tribune's hand moved involuntarily to his sword before he caught himself. Around him, guards tried to hide their reactions. They all knew what was coming, could feel it in the air like electricity before lightning. The emperor might call himself a god, but gods didn't bleed. They were about to prove that with iron certainty. The younger conspirators wanted to strike that very night, their patience finally exhausted. Chaerea restrained them with effort. 3 more days until the games. 72 hours of maintaining facades while rage boiled beneath. He made them repeat the plan until every man could recite his role while asleep. Position, timing, signals. Who would strike first? Who would block escapes? Who would handle any interference? They would have perhaps 30 seconds to complete their work. On the morning of January 24th, 41 AD, Chaerea woke before dawn. He polished his gladius with unusual care, testing the edge until it could split silk. He put on his best uniform, the one he'd worn when Germanicus had promoted him on the Rhine. If today was his last, he would die as the soldier he'd been before shame and passwords and palace duty had twisted him into something else. His reflection in the bronze mirror showed a man who'd found peace in purpose. The other conspirators made their own preparations. Some visited temples, making offerings to gods who might forgive oath-breaking if the cause was just. Others wrote letters to be opened only if they didn't survive, explaining their actions to families who might suffer for their choices. A few simply sat in silence, feeling the weight of what they were about to do settling on their shoulders like armor. As dawn broke over Rome, 30 men were already moving into position. They filtered into the palace in small groups, assuming normal posts, exchanging normal greetings. Everything had to appear routine until the moment arrived. The emperor emerged from his chambers looking particularly pleased with himself, unaware that his morning inspection of the guard was actually a final review by his executioners. On January 24th, 41 AD, as Caligula descended into the underground passage after the games, 30 men waited in the shadows, each carrying a blade and the weight of countless victims' silent screams. The morning sun cast long shadows through the palace corridors as Caligula summoned Senator Marcellus to witness something special. The senator's wife lay sprawled across the imperial bed, her vacant eyes fixed on frescoes depicting the rape of the Sabine women. Her husband stood at attention, his patrician features carefully arranged to show appreciation, as the emperor demonstrated a new technique he'd been perfecting. Marcellus's hands trembled only slightly as he applauded on cue. 3 years of practice had taught him the rhythm of these performances. Outside the chamber, Cassius Chaerea checked the water clock for the 5th time that morning. The emperor's schedule showed a full day ahead. Morning violations followed by Senate briefings, then lunch with Egyptian ambassadors, finally the closing ceremonies at the Palatine Games. Each appointment carefully noted in the guard roster, each transition mapped in the tribune's mind. The Cryptoporticus passage would see heavy traffic during the 7th hour. The Palace Documentation Center had processed 17 new files since dawn. Scribes bent over their tablets, recording details that would haunt their dreams. The morning intake included a Vestal Virgin who'd caught the emperor's eye during yesterday's ceremonies. Her file already contained detailed plans for theological corruption. The researchers compared her measurements to those in Drusilla's archives, calculating points of similarity and difference. Their work continued with mechanical precision, while their souls screamed in silence. Senator Marcellus maintained his frozen smile as his wife's body convulsed in ways that violated natural law. The emperor narrated each action like a teacher, explaining geometry. The guards at the door kept their eyes fixed on middle distance. The slaves holding wine cups learned not to see. Only the water clock's steady drip marked time in a room where minutes stretched into eternities. When the demonstration finally ended, Marcellus thanked the emperor for the educational experience and helped carry his wife's broken form to their litter. By the 9th hour, rumors of special entertainment at the games had drawn larger crowds than usual. Citizens packed the stone seats, their anticipation tinged with the particular dread that accompanied imperial innovations. Vendors sold figs and wine to spectators who might soon lose all appetite. The gladiators warming up in the tunnels below wondered what fresh horror would overshadow their choreographed violence. Even the arena sand seemed to hold its breath. The conspirators were already in position throughout the palace complex. Marcus Vinicius stood guard at the northern entrance, his perfumed uniform attracting early morning insects. Cornelius Sabinus covered the southern approach, his jaw tight as he watched his pregnant wife's sedan chair disappear down the street. Each man knew his role in the dance about to begin. Each had counted the steps from their post to the cryptoporticus. 27 paces for Vinicius, 34 for Sabinus, close enough to converge when the signal came. In the imperial box at the games, Caligula surveyed his subjects with the satisfaction of a farmer examining ripe crops. He pointed out specific women in the crowd to his secretary, who dutifully added their names to selection lists. A merchant's daughter with unusual green eyes. A cavalry officer's sister, whose fear showed in interesting ways. The emperor's attention moved through the crowd like a plague, marking future victims with invisible brands. Those who noticed his gaze tried to shrink into their seats, to become invisible through sheer will. The gladiatorial matches proceeded with unusual violence, as if the fighters sensed the day's electric tension. Blood sprayed across the sand in patterns that seemed to spell out accusations. The crowd's cheers carried undertones of hysteria. Even the professional gamblers seemed distracted, their usual calculations disrupted by indefinable anxiety. The emperor barely watched the combat, his mind already moving ahead to the special entertainment he'd planned for the closing ceremony. Chaerea received word that 3 senators' wives had been brought to the preparation chambers beneath the arena. The tribune relayed the information without expression, his voice steady despite the bile rising in his throat. Another password to deliver, another degradation to endure. But this would be the last time. His hand brushed the gladius at his side, feeling the weight of sharpened iron and sharper purpose. The other guards noticed nothing unusual in their commander's movements. The Egyptian ambassadors arrived for their scheduled lunch, their diplomatic smiles faltering as they entered the dining hall. The couches arranged in particular patterns, the servants' dead eyes, the strange stains on Syrian silk cushions. They'd heard rumors in Alexandria about Rome's new customs, but witnessing the reality made their translator's voice shake. The emperor received them wearing a toga that seemed to shimmer with barely dried fluids, his smile promising cultural exchanges they hadn't come to negotiate. As the 10th hour approached, the palace rhythms shifted subtly toward convergence. Guards changed shifts with practiced efficiency. Senators hurried through corridors toward afternoon sessions. Slaves scurried between tasks, their movements creating patterns only visible from above. The building itself seemed to funnel activity towards certain passages, certain inevitable intersections. The water clocks throughout the palace dripped in synchronization, marking time toward an appointment the emperor hadn't scheduled. In the documentation center, a young scribe named Lucius made a curious notation. The emperor's movements that day followed an unusually predictable pattern, the same route he'd taken during 3 previous game days, the same timing between appointments, the same preference for the cryptoporticus when moving between the palace and arena. Lucius wondered if he should alert someone to this security risk, then remembered what happened to those who showed too much initiative. He filed the observation with all the others that would never be read. The special entertainment began as the sun reached its zenith. 3 naked figures were led onto the arena sand, their identities hidden by masks depicting comedy and tragedy. The crowd's anticipation curdled into familiar dread as they recognized the scenario. Another divine demonstration, another lesson in power, but something felt different this time. The emperor's movements seemed rushed, distracted, his usual theatrical precision replaced by impatient gestures, as if he had somewhere else to be. One of the victims stumbled, her mask slipping to reveal the face of Senator Quintus's wife. The crowd's gasp echoed off stone walls like a collective wound. Even by current standards, this selection pushed boundaries. Quintus sat in the Senate section, his famous composure finally shattering as he watched his wife of 20 years reduced to arena entertainment. His colleagues restrained him from rushing the sands, their grips firm but sympathetic. Everyone understood the mathematics of intervention. The emperor's commentary lacked its usual artistry. His attention kept drifting to the water clock, to the passage exits, to something beyond the immediate spectacle. The guards performing the demonstration noticed their master's distraction and faltered in their choreography. One accidentally struck with too much force, drawing genuine screams that broke through the victim's trained responses. Caligula's irritation at the imperfection showed in his tightening jaw, his drumming fingers, his glances toward the cryptoporticus entrance. The 7th hour was fast approaching as the arena entertainment concluded with unusual haste. The emperor rose from his seat while victims still lay sobbing on the sand. His purple toga swirled as he turned toward the underground passage, citing urgent palace business. The crowd remained frozen in their seats, unsure if they were permitted to leave. The usual closing ceremonies hadn't been performed. The gladiators waited in confusion for dismissal orders that didn't come. Everything felt unfinished, suspended, waiting for some conclusion that hadn't arrived. Chorea received the predetermined signal from a conspirator stationed at the arena entrance. 3 sharp whistles meant the emperor was moving. The tribune's pulse quickened as he relayed commands to his men. Standard security positioning for imperial movement through the cryptoporticus. Nothing unusual in their deployment, just 30 guards taking their assigned places along an underground corridor. The fact that each carried personal grievances along with their swords remained invisible to casual observation. The Egyptian ambassadors found themselves abandoned mid-negotiation as the emperor departed for his urgent business. They sat among the remains of untouched delicacies, wondering if this abrupt exit was another form of psychological warfare. The dining hall's silence pressed against their ears like deep water. One ambassador noticed dried blood beneath his couch that slaves had missed during cleaning. They gathered their documents and departed without formal dismissal, eager to escape whatever energies gathered in the palace air. Slaves throughout the complex felt the atmospheric shift without understanding its source. Conversations died mid-sentence. Routine tasks were forgotten. The kitchen staff stopped their preparations and stood listening to nothing. The laundry women let silk garments soak too long in their basins. Even the palace cats abandoned their hunting to huddle in corners. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. In the cryptoporticus, shadows gathered like conspirators. The underground passage stretched 60 paces beneath the Palatine Hill, its walls sweating moisture that made torches sputter. Stone worn smooth by countless imperial processions now waited to witness history of a different kind. The acoustics that normally carried whispers from end to end would soon amplify other sounds. Guards took their positions with unusual precision, each man counting steps, measuring distances, calculating angles of attack. Cornelius Sabinus arrived at his post near the passage's midpoint. His wife's pregnancy made her exempt from palace summons, but he'd watched too many other families destroyed. His blade rested loose in its sheath, ready for quick draw. To his left, Marcus Vinicius adjusted his perfumed uniform one final time. The scent of roses would mix with iron before the hour ended. They avoided eye contact, maintaining the illusion of routine duty, while their hearts hammered battle rhythms. The sound of footsteps echoed from the arena entrance, multiple sets moving at the emperor's characteristic quick pace. Caligula never strolled when he could stride, never walked when he could rush toward his next amusement. The conspirators straightened at their posts, hands drifting to sword hilts with practiced casualness. The moment they'd planned for months was seconds away. The underground passage that had swallowed so many victims was about to claim its ultimate prize. More guards filtered into position as the footsteps grew louder. Some had lost sisters to the palace collection. Others had been forced to watch wives and daughters processed through the documentation center. Each carried names of the broken, memories of screams, images that made sleep impossible. Their grievances had been carefully catalogued during recruitment, ensuring every conspirator had personal stakes beyond political gain. This wasn't just regime change. This was collective vengeance distilled to a single moment. The emperor's voice preceded him into the passage, humming a Greek melody about divine transformation. The tune bounced off stone walls in eerie harmonics. Behind him, his regular escort maintained standard formation, unaware that today's security contained its own threat. The purple toga appeared at the passage entrance like a banner announcing the arrival of everything the conspirators hated. Time slowed as training took over, each man's world narrowing to their assigned role. At exactly 1 p.m., Caligula entered the crypto-porticus, humming a Greek tune. In 60 seconds, the man who thought himself immortal would discover just how human he really was. The shadows moved wrong in the crypto-porticus. 30 men shifting weight from foot to foot, hands too close to sword hilts, breath too shallow for routine duty. Caligula's sandals slapped against wet stone as he entered the passage, his purple toga dragging through puddles that reflected torchlight like blood. Behind him, 4 members of his personal guard maintained standard formation, unaware their brothers had already chosen sides. Cassius Chaerea stepped from his position near the eastern wall. The movement looked routine, a tribune adjusting security as his emperor passed. His voice carried that high-pitched Caligula loved to mock as he spoke the predetermined phrase. The Germanic delegation awaits your divine presence. Code words that meant 30 swords would soon taste imperial blood. The emperor barely glanced at his tribune, still humming that Greek melody about gods walking among mortals. 3 more steps into the passage. 5 more seconds until he reached the point where escape became impossible. The conspirators' breathing synchronized without conscious thought, dozens of lungs drawing air for what came next. Your divinity. Chaerea's voice cracked on the title. Not from fear but from fury held too long. The emperor turned, mouth already forming another insult about his tribune's feminine tones. The words died unspoken as Chaerea's gladius cleared its sheath with a sound like tearing silk. Time fractured into heartbeats and blade edges. The first strike caught Caligula between neck and shoulder, purple toga blooming darker red. He staggered backward, eyes wide with the particular shock of gods discovering mortality. His mouth opened to speak, to command, to threaten divine retribution. Only blood emerged, spattering the stone floor in patterns that would never be documented. The signal given, 29 more swords emerged from shadows. Some men wept as they struck, others smiled. Marcus Vinicius drove his blade deep while the scent of his mandatory perfume mixed with copper and fear. Cornelius Sabinus thought of his pregnant wife as his sword found flesh. Each thrust carried a name, a memory, a specific moment when honor died and only vengeance remained. Caligula's own guards hesitated for one crucial second, torn between duty and the recognition that they too had grievances. That pause sealed their emperor's fate. By the time they moved to defend him, he'd already taken 7 wounds. Their half-hearted resistance ended when they recognized how many conspirators surrounded them. Some joined the attack. Others simply stepped aside, choosing survival over loyalty to a man who'd made their service synonymous with shame. The emperor fought back with desperate violence, his fingernails raking across faces, his teeth finding exposed flesh. Even dying, he possessed the vicious cunning that had terrorized an empire. He grabbed young Lucius by the throat, trying to use the conspirator as a shield. The boy, whose sister had died in the documentation center, pressed forward instead of pulling away. The movement drove 3 more blades deeper into imperial flesh. Stabbing sounds echoed off stone walls with wet, percussive rhythms. Each impact produced its own note, creating a symphony of vengeance that would haunt the survivors' dreams. The torches flickered with the movement of so many bodies in narrow space, casting shadows that made it seem like 100 men attacked instead of 30. The emperor's purple toga tangled around his legs as he tried to flee, the garment that had symbolized ultimate power becoming a shroud. You dare touch a god. Caligula's words came out bubbled with blood, his divine pretensions persisting even as mortality painted the walls. I'll have you all flayed, your families fed too. 2. The threat dissolved into choking as Chaerea's blade found his throat. The tribune leaned close, his high voice steady for once, as he whispered something that made the dying emperor's eyes widen with understanding. More strikes fell with mechanical precision. These weren't soldiers anymore, but instruments of collective rage. Each wound represented a victim, a family destroyed, a soul broken on the altar of imperial appetite. Someone was counting aloud, marking each thrust against mental ledgers of loss. That's for Julia Quinta, steel through silk. For the harvest festival, iron finding organs. For Drusilla, you monster. The names poured out like prayers answered in blood. A sound escaped Caligula that might have been laughter, or might have been drowning. His hands clutched at wounds too numerous to count, trying to hold in divinity that leaked through his fingers. His eyes found Charea's face among the attackers, focusing with the clarity that comes before darkness. "Venus," he mouthed, assigning one last mocking password. The tribune's response was another thrust, delivered with the precision of a soldier who'd finally found an enemy worth killing. The documentation center's files would record 23 wounds, though the actual count reached 30. Scribes who'd catalogued thousands of violations struggled to describe this reversal, their clinical language failing to capture the savagery of justice delivered in shadows. Some wounds were deep enough to kill instantly, others were shallow, meant to hurt rather than end. The variation told its own story of personal vengeances measured in steel. The Emperor's legs gave out when the count reached 20. He fell to his knees in the spreading pool, purple toga soaking red from hem to collar. Still the blades fell, driven by men who needed to ensure this particular god stayed dead. The wet sounds of impact gradually slowed, as even rage exhausted itself against unresponding flesh. The passage fell silent except for heavy breathing and the drip of fluids onto stone. Caligula's final words came out as whispers that only Charea heard clearly. Not threats or pleas, but a horrible recognition, as if he finally understood that gods who made themselves from mortal suffering could unmake themselves the same way. His lips formed names, victims perhaps, or possibly the sisters he'd transformed into props for divine theatre. Whatever message he tried to convey dissolved into the particular rattle that marked the boundary between Emperor and Carrion. The conspirators stood in a circle around what remained, their swords still drawn, unable to quite believe they'd done it. Purple silk clung to cooling flesh that had commanded legions and destroyed thousands. The man who'd thought himself Jupiter's equal lay twisted on stone that had witnessed his victims' final journeys. Someone laughed, harsh and broken. Another vomited against the wall. Most simply stared, waiting for the corpse to rise, to transform, to reveal this as another divine jest. Footsteps echoed from the arena entrance, more guards responding to sounds of violence. The conspirators had planned for this, some designated to explain, others to secure exits. Yet they struggled to move, transfixed by the sight of ultimate power reduced to meat. It was Charea who broke the spell, his voice carrying the authority of duty completed. They had minutes to control the narrative, to prevent loyalist retaliation, to ensure the Empire understood that justice, not chaos, had visited the crypto-porticus. Blood pooled in depressions worn by centuries of foot traffic, creating a map of red rivers across ancient stone. The torches continued burning with mundane persistence, illuminating a scene that would reshape Rome's understanding of power's limits. 30 men had entered this passage as victims of systematic humiliation. They emerged as killers, liberators, or traitors, depending on who wrote the histories. The corpse they left behind would be remembered as either a god brought low or a monster finally caged. As they prepared to face whatever came next, one detail haunted the conspirators. In those final moments, as steel divided flesh and purple became red, Caligula had smiled, not with defiance or madness, but with something worse, recognition, as if he'd always known this ending waited in the shadows, as if every documented horror had been building toward this moment of violent punctuation. The god emperor had orchestrated his own apocalypse, and they'd merely played their assigned parts. But the story couldn't end with just his death. The empire he'd corrupted still breathed, wounded and waiting. The shadow of trauma he'd cast would outlive his cooling corpse. In the Senate, in the temples, in thousands of Roman homes, citizens would soon learn their tormentor had fallen. Some would celebrate, others would mourn. Most would simply wonder what new horrors would fill the vacuum left by a god's assassination. The body count would rise before the day ended. Loyalists who resisted the new order, conspirators who knew too much, witnesses whose silence needed purchasing with steel. The mathematics of regime change demanded payment in blood, and Rome had developed expensive tastes. The sewers that had carried away evidence of palace horrors would soon run red with political necessity. Order would return, But first came the accounting. News travelled through Rome with the speed of terror becoming relief. In the Forum, merchants who'd hidden their daughters suddenly stood taller. In the temples, priests began planning purification rituals for altars that had witnessed blasphemy. In noble homes, families reunited with members they'd thought lost to imperial appetite. The city exhaled collectively, not yet understanding that some wounds festered regardless of the weapon's removal. Trauma had its own timeline, independent of political change. The Senate convened in emergency session while Caligula's blood still cooled in the cryptoporticus. Old men who'd cowered for 4 years suddenly discovered their voices. Speeches condemning the dead emperor poured forth with the fervor of those rewriting their own complicity. They voted to declare Caligula's acts void, his victims restored to honor, his memory condemned. The same voices that had approved his budgets for systematic horror now competed to denounce what they'd enabled. In the palace, slaves began the careful work of transformation. The observation chambers were sealed. The documentation center's files mysteriously caught fire, though some scribes managed to save select records that might prove useful later. The architectural modifications that had enabled systematic violation were marked for demolition. Physical evidence could be erased even if memories persisted in the minds of those who'd cleaned the floors and changed the sheets. Claudius heard the news while hiding behind a curtain in the palace, convinced the assassins would come for all imperial blood. The stammering, limping uncle whom Caligula had kept as a jest would soon be proclaimed emperor by Praetorian guards who needed stability more than vengeance. History pivoted on the terror of a disabled man who'd survived by playing the fool, who'd witnessed horrors while pretending not to understand. His reign would attempt to heal wounds his nephew had carved into Rome's soul. The immediate aftermath produced unexpected cruelties. Some of Caligula's victims, broken beyond repair, couldn't process their torturer's death. They'd been conditioned to respond to specific stimuli, trained through repetition to expect certain patterns. Without their abuser, they moved through days like stringless puppets, their minds unable to accept freedom. Several took their own lives, rather than face a world where their suffering had no author, no purpose, no divine explanation. Families reunited with daughters and wives discovered that bodies could return while souls remained imprisoned. Husbands found themselves sleeping beside strangers who wore familiar faces. Children couldn't recognize mothers whose eyes had seen too much. The documentation center had recorded physical violations in clinical detail, but no scribe had captured the precise moment when a person broke beyond healing. Those measurements couldn't be catalogued or filed or burned away. The conspirators themselves struggled with victory's weight. They'd planned for the killing, but not for the living that followed. Cherea found himself waking at the hours when he'd once delivered shameful passwords, his body maintaining rhythms of humiliation even after their source was gone. Sabinus watched his pregnant wife with new fears, wondering if violence lived in blood, if their child would inherit the capacity for necessary murder. They'd saved Rome, but the saving had its own costs. Religious authorities faced the delicate work of reconsecrating defiled spaces. Temples that had hosted forced ceremonies needed purification beyond any traditional ritual. Some priests advocated abandoning the buildings entirely, constructing new sacred spaces untouched by imperial blasphemy. Others argued that redemption required confronting corruption directly, transforming sites of horror back into houses of healing. The theological debates revealed how deeply Caligula's innovations had poisoned Rome's spiritual foundations. The trials began within days, targeting those who'd enabled the emperor's systems, guards who'd been too enthusiastic in their duties, scribes who'd documented suffering with excessive precision, priests who'd blessed violence while claiming divine mandate. Yet prosecution proved complex when everyone from senator to slave had been complicit through participation or silence. How could justice pass degrees of collaboration when survival itself had required compromise? Economic consequences rippled outward as Rome adjusted to the absence of systematized terror. Properties that had been abandoned to avoid imperial attention suddenly became valuable again. Trade routes that had diverted around the capital returned to traditional patterns. The peculiar economy that had grown around avoiding notice, bribing selectors, purchasing protective anonymity, collapsed overnight. Legitimate business could resume, though merchants struggled to remember how normal transactions worked. Yet even as Rome celebrated liberation, observers noted troubling patterns. The methods Caligula had pioneered didn't die with him. The architecture of surveillance, the bureaucracy of documentation, the techniques for breaking minds through systematic application of trauma, all persisted in institutional memory. Future emperors would study his innovations, learning what worked while avoiding his theatrical excesses. The laboratory had been dismantled, but the experimental results remained. Nero would refine the use of sexual terror as political weapon, though with more focus on spectacle than system. Domitian would perfect the documentation techniques, creating files that destroyed through implication rather than action. Each successive tyrant would build on foundations Caligula had laid, transforming his crude innovations into sophisticated tools of control. The little boy in soldier's boots had taught the empire that bodies could be weapons and shame could be chains. Modern historians struggle to quantify Caligula's impact, parsing ancient sources that alternate between salacious detail and traumatized silence. The numbers tell one story: thousands processed through palace systems, hundreds dead by direct action, dozens driven to suicide. But statistics can't capture the generational damage. The way children who witnessed his celebrations grew into adults who flinched at purple fabric, who couldn't enter certain buildings, who passed their nightmares to their own offspring like inherited debt. The documentation center's surviving files offer glimpses into industrialized depravity that challenge comprehension. Page after page of careful notation, human suffering reduced to metrics and methods. Yet between the lines, readers can find moments of resistance, victims who fought back, scribes who subtly altered records to protect families, guards who looked away at crucial moments. Even within systems designed to crush humanity, humanity persisted in small acts of defiance. Psychologists studying historical trauma recognize patterns in Caligula's methods that appear in modern contexts. The careful isolation of victims, the use of family bonds as weapons, the corruption of safe spaces into sites of horror, the transformation of protectors into predators. His innovations in systematic abuse created templates that would be unconsciously replicated by those who'd never heard his name. Evil, it seems, converges on certain efficient forms regardless of era or culture. The question haunts historians. Could it happen again? Could another society create conditions where one person's pathology infects an entire civilization? The answer terrifies in its simplicity. All it requires is concentrated power meeting broken personality in a system without meaningful checks. Add citizens exhausted by crisis, institutions corrupted by fear, and the slow normalization of extremity. The ingredients exist in every era, waiting for the right catalyst to combine them. Some argue Caligula was unique, a perfect storm of childhood trauma, unlimited power, and societal vulnerabilities. Others see him as merely an extreme example of dynamics that operate in subtler forms throughout history. The documentation center might be exceptional, but the impulse to reduce humans to objects for pleasure appears across cultures and centuries. Perhaps Rome's transparency about its horrors serves as warning about what civilized societies can become when civilization becomes a mask rather than a value. The cryptoporticus where Caligula died remained closed for years after his assassination. Slaves reported hearing sounds from the sealed passage, claims dismissed as superstition by authorities eager to forget. When finally reopened during Claudius's renovations, workers found the stones still stained despite repeated cleanings. They paved over the original floor rather than attempt further purification, burying the physical evidence under new marble. Yet tour guides noted that even centuries later, visitors complained of unexpected chills in that particular corridor. Modern Rome built over the ancient palace grounds, apartments and offices rising where horrors once played out. Occasionally, construction crews uncover fragments that archaeologists struggle to categorize. Restraint fixtures too elaborate for simple slavery, architectural modifications that served no legitimate purpose, documents preserved by accident that hint at systematic processes scholars prefer not to reconstruct. The city continues forward, but its foundations remember. The ultimate tragedy might be how unnecessary it all was. Caligula possessed intelligence, charisma, and the love of Rome's people when he first took power. He could have been remembered for public works, military victories, cultural achievements. Instead, he chose to perfect the art of human destruction, transforming potential greatness into actualized horror. His legacy lives not in monuments, but in the minds of those who learned that power without conscience creates hells more efficient than any demon could design. Perhaps that's the lesson worth preserving from the shadow of Caligula's reign. Not the salacious details that titillate and disgust, but the recognition that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flair. It builds slowly, system by system, compromise by compromise, until atrocity becomes bureaucracy and horror becomes routine. The little boy in boots didn't transform into a monster overnight. He evolved through 1,000 small permissions, each cruelty enabling the next, until even gods couldn't contain what he'd become. Citizens of any era would do well to remember that, to watch for the normalization of cruelty, to resist the transformation of humans into categories, to maintain the bright lines that separate necessary authority from sadistic pleasure, because the distance between a functional society and systematized horror is measured not in miles but in moments of moral choice. Caligula's Rome fell that distance in less than 4 years. In the end, 30 men with swords proved that even gods could bleed, but they couldn't undo the bleeding he'd caused, couldn't restore what systematic trauma had stolen, couldn't resurrect the souls that had died long before their bodies. They could only ensure that this particular god would create no more victims. The blood that pooled in the cryptoporticus was just blood, not divine ichor. The corpse that cooled on ancient stone was just meat, not immortal flesh. And perhaps that's the most important truth preserved from January 24th, 41 AD. Strip away the purple toga, the divine pretensions, the elaborate systems of control, and what remains is merely human, terrifyingly human, capable of atrocities that no demon would conceive, but also vulnerable to the same steel that cuts any flesh. The God-Emperor discovered in his final moments what his victims had always known. Even gods can be screaming in the dark.